"You're going to get hurt, old-timer." That's what the instructor said to a 77-year-old man standing in the doorway of a self-defense gym on a Tuesday evening in March. He said it loud enough for the entire class to hear, loud enough for every head to turn, loud enough for the old man's granddaughter standing right beside him to feel the heat of embarrassment climb her neck. The old man didn't flinch, didn't blink. He just looked the instructor dead in the eye and said, "I appreciate the concern, son." What happened next left that instructor and every single person in that room completely speechless. If you believe that respect has no age limit, type wrist lock in the comments right now and stay with me, because this story is one you won't forget. Harold Eugene Maddox was not the kind of man who made noise about himself. He was 77 years old, stood about 5'10" when his back wasn't bothering him, and walked with a noticeable limp on his left side, the result of a piece of Iraqi shrapnel that had been lodged near his femoral nerve since February of 1991 and had never been fully removed. He carried a wooden cane with a brass handle shaped like an eagle's head, and he used it not because he couldn't walk without it, but because the pain on cold mornings told him he'd better not push his luck. His hands were thick, scarred at the knuckles, and still remarkably steady for a man his age. His face was weathered by decades of sun, wind, and the kind of silence that only men who've seen real violence learn to carry. He wore a plain grey t-shirt tucked into belted khaki trousers, a pair of scuffed brown boots, and a faded olive-green field jacket with no patches, no insignia, and no indication whatsoever of the life he'd lived before settling into his quiet routine in Cedar Falls, Iowa. Harold had moved to Cedar Falls 11 years earlier, after his wife, Ruth, passed away from pancreatic cancer. They'd been married 46 years. After her funeral, Harold sold the house in Fayetteville, packed one duffel bag and 3 boxes of photographs, and drove north until the land flattened out and the noise in his head got a little quieter. He rented a small house on Searly Boulevard with a screened porch and a backyard that backed up to a creek. He didn't join any veterans organizations. He didn't attend parades. He didn't put a flag decal on his truck or wear a hat that said anything about where he'd been. He went to the hardware store. He fed the birds. He read Louis L'Amour novels on the porch in the evenings. And every Sunday he drove across town to have dinner with his granddaughter, Ellie, the only family he had left within 500 miles. Ellie was 24, finishing her second year of nursing school, working part-time at a walk-in clinic on University Avenue. She was sharp, compassionate, and fiercely protective of her grandfather, even though he never once asked for protection. It was Ellie who had found the flyer for the self-defense workshop pinned to the corkboard at her clinic. The flyer read, "Real-world self-defense for all ages and fitness levels. Beginners welcome, no experience needed." She'd brought it up at their Sunday dinner 2 weeks before, sliding it across the table between the mashed potatoes and the roast chicken. "Grandpa, I want to take this class, but I don't want to go alone. Will you come with me?" Harold had looked at the flyer, then at her, and without a word of hesitation said, "Sure, sweetheart. When do we start?" He didn't tell her why he said yes so easily. He didn't tell her that the last time he'd practiced combatives was in a windowless room at Fort Bragg in 1989, or that the last time he'd used them was in a hallway in Basra that smelled like diesel and copper. He just folded the flyer, put it in his jacket pocket, and asked if there was any more gravy. The gym was called Iron Path Training Center, and it occupied the ground floor of a converted warehouse on West First Street. The front window had been painted with the gym's logo, a fist inside a shield, and the interior was exactly what you'd expect. Rubber mats on the floor, heavy bags hanging from ceiling mounts, a wall of mirrors, a rack of pads and gloves, and a faint permanent smell of sweat and disinfectant that no amount of ventilation would ever fully address. There were about 18 people in the room when Harold and Ellie walked in that Tuesday evening. Most of them were in their 20s and 30s, a few were in their 40s. There was one woman who looked to be in her early 50s stretching by the far wall. Harold was, by a significant margin, the oldest person there. He was also the only one carrying a cane. The instructor's name was Kyle Brandt. He was 28 years old, 6'1", about 210 pounds of carefully maintained muscle that he displayed in a fitted black compression shirt, with the gym's logo printed across the chest. He had a sharp jawline, a high and tight haircut, and the kind of loud, commanding voice that filled a room whether it needed to be filled or not. Kyle had played defensive end at a Division III college, earned his personal training certification at 23, and opened Iron Path 2 years later with a small business loan and a lot of confidence. He had a modest following on social media, where he posted clips of himself demonstrating techniques with impressive speed and power. His bio read, "Teaching real people, real skills for real situations." What Kyle had never done, not once, not ever, was face a real situation himself. Every technique he taught, he had learned from a textbook, a seminar, or a YouTube video. He had never been punched in the face with genuine intent. He had never felt the animal terror of someone trying to end his life in a confined space. He had never heard the sound a joint makes when it's taken past its natural limit by someone who knows exactly what they're doing and has made peace with the consequences. But Kyle didn't know what he didn't know, and that's the most dangerous kind of ignorance there is. Harold and Ellie signed in at the front desk. A young woman with a ponytail and a clipboard handed them liability waivers, which they both signed without much fuss. Ellie was wearing leggings and a university sweatshirt. Harold was still in his khakis and field jacket. The young woman glanced at Harold's cane, then at Harold, then at Ellie, and said, with more gentleness than was necessary, "The chairs for observers are along the back wall." Ellie started to say, "Oh, he's not observing, he's—" But Harold put a hand on her arm, smiled at the young woman and said, "Thank you, Ma'am, we'll find our way." They walked onto the mat together. Harold set his cane against the wall near the mirror carefully, the way a man sets down something he respects. He stood straight, or as straight as his back and his leg would allow, and looked out at the room. A few people noticed him. A few looked away quickly. One young man in the second row nudged his friend and whispered something that made them both grin. Harold saw it. He didn't react. Kyle stepped onto the mat at exactly 7 o'clock. He clapped his hands twice, the sharp sound cutting through the chatter, and the room fell quiet. "All right, everybody. Welcome to Real World Self-Defense Session 1. My name's Kyle. I'm the head instructor here at Iron Path, and over the next 6 weeks, I'm going to teach you how to protect yourself and the people you love in situations you hope you'll never face." He paced the front of the room as he talked, making eye contact with each row. His voice was rehearsed, polished, the kind of delivery that comes from saying the same speech dozens of times. "Now, before we get started, I need to be upfront with you. This is a physical class. We will be making contact. We will be drilling techniques on each other, and I need everyone here to be honest with themselves about their physical capabilities, because my number one priority is that nobody gets hurt on my watch." His eyes swept the room as he said this, and they landed on Harold. They lingered. "Sir," Kyle said, stepping forward. The room was quiet. 18 pairs of eyes followed Kyle's gaze to the old man standing near the back of the mat in his tucked-in grey t-shirt and belted khakis. "Sir, can I talk to you for a second?" Harold looked at him. "You can talk to me right here." There was no challenge in Harold's voice, no edge, just a simple statement of fact. Kyle walked closer. He dropped his voice slightly, though not nearly enough for the conversation to be private. "Look, I appreciate you coming out tonight, I really do. But I want to be straight with you. This class involves a lot of physical contact, partner drills, takedowns, joint locks. I noticed you came in with a cane, and I just want to make sure you're aware that this might not be the right fit for you." He paused, smiled the kind of smile people smile when they think they're being kind but are really being something else entirely. "We've got chairs along the back wall. You're more than welcome to watch. Support your— Is that your granddaughter?" He gestured toward Ellie. Ellie's jaw tightened. Harold nodded. "She is." "Great. You can cheer her on. No shame in that." Harold looked at Kyle for a long moment. The room was dead silent. Someone coughed. The fluorescent lights buzzed overhead. Harold's face was unreadable. The kind of stillness that comes not from a lack of feeling, but from a lifetime of disciplining every emotion until it sits exactly where you tell it to sit. "I appreciate the concern, son," Harold said. His voice was low, even, and carried the kind of quiet authority that doesn't need volume. "But I signed the waiver. I paid the fee, and I came here to take the class. If it's all the same to you, I'd like to participate." There was a beat of silence. Kyle stared at Harold, his smile flickering, not quite sure whether he'd just been challenged or simply answered. Then he shrugged, a theatrical palms-up gesture for the benefit of the room. "Hey, your call, man. I just don't want you getting hurt." He turned back to the class. "All right, everybody, let's warm up." The warm-up was standard. Jumping jacks, high knees, arm circles, a few minutes of light stretching. Harold did what he could. He skipped the jumping jacks entirely, standing in place and rotating his wrists and ankles with the kind of deliberate, methodical focus that suggested he'd done warm-ups like this 1,000 times before, just not these particular warm-ups. He couldn't do the high knees, so he marched in place, lifting his good leg higher than his bad one, his face betraying nothing about whatever pain the movement caused. A woman next to him, mid-30s, dark hair pulled back, glanced at him with a mix of pity and concern. He caught her glance and gave her a small nod that seemed to say, "I'm fine, but thank you." Ellie, 2 rows ahead, kept looking back over her shoulder. Harold caught her eye once and gave her a look she knew well, the look that meant stop worrying and pay attention to what you're doing. After the warm-up, Kyle moved into the first demonstration. He called it situational awareness and initial response. But what it really amounted to was Kyle talking for 10 minutes about how most people freeze in dangerous situations and how his program was designed to overcome that freeze response. He used phrases like predator mindset and warrior activation and controlled aggression protocol, and Harold listened to every word without expression. Then Kyle said, "Okay, time to pair up. I want you to find a partner roughly your size and fitness level. We're going to start with a basic wrist grab escape. Someone grabs your wrist, you break free. Simple stuff, but it's foundational." The room shuffled into pairs. Ellie paired with the dark-haired woman. The young men who'd been grinning earlier paired with each other. Harold stood where he was, looking round calmly, waiting. No one approached him. A few people glanced his way and then quickly looked elsewhere, the way people avoid eye contact with someone sitting alone in a waiting room. Harold didn't move. He just stood with his hands at his sides and waited with the patience of a man who has waited in far worse places for far longer. Kyle noticed. He walked over, and this time he didn't even try to lower his voice. "Okay, tell you what," he said, loud enough for the nearest dozen people to hear. "Since we've got an odd number, I'll pair you up." He turned and scanned the room, and his eyes settled on a man in the front row. "Marcus, come here." Marcus Delano was 25 years old, 6'4", 265 pounds, a former college offensive lineman who'd kept most of the muscle and added very little of the fat. He had hands like dinner plates, a neck wider than Harold's thigh, and he moved with the slow, careful economy of a man who'd spent his life learning to control a body that was built for collision. Marcus walked over, looked at Harold, and immediately looked uncomfortable. "Kyle, I don't know about this man." "It's fine," Kyle said, still smiling. "It's just a wrist grab drill. Controlled environment. Harold here says he can handle it." He turned to Harold. "That's your name, right? Harold?" "That's right. Harold, this is Marcus. Marcus, Harold, let's see what we've got." Kyle patted Marcus on the shoulder and walked away to supervise the other pairs, but he kept glancing back. Everyone in the room knew what this was. Kyle had paired the oldest, smallest, most visibly fragile person in the room with the biggest, strongest one. Whether he intended it as a lesson, a joke, or a gentle way of proving his point about Harold being out of his depth, the effect was the same. It was a setup, and Harold knew it. Marcus looked down at Harold. And he really did have to look down because there were 6 inches and nearly 100 pounds between them, and said quietly, almost apologetically, "Hey man, I'll go easy. We'll just walk through it." Harold looked up at Marcus. The old man's eyes, pale blue and steady, didn't waver. "I appreciate that, son. But why don't we just do the drill the way it's meant to be done? Go ahead and grab my wrist whenever you're ready." Marcus hesitated. He looked over his shoulder at Kyle, who was watching from 15 feet away with his arms crossed and an expression that sat somewhere between curiosity and amusement. Kyle gave a slight nod. Marcus turned back to Harold, reached out with his right hand and grabbed Harold's left wrist. Marcus's grip was firm, the way you'd grab a handrail on a swaying bus. Solid, automatic, not aggressive, but undeniably strong. For a fraction of a second, nothing happened. Harold's hand was wrapped in Marcus's much larger one, and it looked, from the outside, like exactly the mismatch everyone in the room expected it to be. Then Harold moved. What happened next took less than 3 seconds. If you blinked, you missed the mechanics. If you didn't blink, you still probably couldn't explain what you'd seen. Harold's right hand came up and covered Marcus's gripping hand, pressing it against his own wrist. Simultaneously, Harold rotated his left forearm inward, not with strength, but with a precision that was almost surgical, turning against the natural axis of Marcus's thumb. In the same fluid motion, Harold stepped offline to his right, angling his body at approximately 45 degrees to Marcus's centerline, and applied downward pressure on Marcus's wrist while his left hand controlled the back of Marcus's hand, bending it at an angle that the human wrist was never designed to accommodate under load. The leverage was devastating. It didn't matter that Marcus was 6'4" and 265. It didn't matter that Marcus could bench press 350 pounds, or that his forearms were thicker than most people's calves. The wrist lock bypassed all of it. Every pound of muscle, every inch of height, every advantage Marcus had, because it targeted the one structure that couldn't be strengthened by any amount of lifting, the joint itself. Marcus's knees buckled first, then his torso folded, and then, in one continuous motion that looked almost gentle from a distance, Marcus went flat on his back on the mat, his right arm extended straight up, his wrist still locked in Harold's grip, his face a mask of wide-eyed, open-mouthed disbelief. He didn't hit the mat hard. Harold had controlled the descent the whole way, but he was down, completely, unmistakably, undeniably down. The room went silent. Not the polite silence of people waiting for someone to speak. The airless silence of a room full of people who have just seen something they cannot reconcile with what they believed 5 seconds ago. 18 people stood frozen on the rubber mats of Iron Path Training Centre, their wrist grab drills forgotten, their mouths slightly open, their eyes locked on the 77-year-old man who was standing, perfectly balanced, perfectly calm, his grip still precise and controlled, over the largest person in the room, who was lying flat on his back and breathing in short, rapid bursts, not from pain, but from the sheer neurological shock of having been put on the ground by someone he outweighed by nearly 100 pounds. Harold held the lock for one more second. Then gently he released Marcus's wrist, stepped back and extended his hand to help him up. Marcus took it. He got to his feet slowly, rolling his wrist, opening and closing his fingers. He looked at Harold with an expression that had nothing in common with the uncomfortable pity he'd shown 30 seconds earlier. It was something closer to awe. What was that? Marcus said. Harold gave a small, almost imperceptible shrug. Wrist lock, he said. Works better when you do it right. Kyle Brandt hadn't moved. He was still standing 15 feet away, his arms no longer crossed but hanging at his sides, his carefully constructed persona of confidence and authority visibly cracking like thin ice under a heavy boot. He'd seen what happened. Everyone had seen what happened. But Kyle had seen something the others hadn't. He'd watched Harold's footwork, the way the old man had shifted offline with a lateral step that was economical, automatic and tactically perfect, moving off the line of force while simultaneously creating an angle of control. He'd seen the hand placement, which wasn't the basic wrist grab escape he'd been about to teach, not even close, but a transition directly from the grab into an offensive joint lock, something that required not just knowledge, but the kind of neuromuscular memory that only came from years, decades, of repetition under pressure. And he'd seen the control. Harold could have snapped Marcus's wrist. Kyle knew enough about joint locks to understand that. The fact that he didn't, the fact that Marcus was standing up now with full function in his hand and nothing worse than a bewildered expression, told Kyle something specific. This old man wasn't just trained. He was trained to a level where he could modulate the application of a potentially crippling technique with the precision of a surgeon adjusting a blade. Kyle had never seen anyone do that in person. He'd only ever read about it. The room was buzzing now. The silence had broken into a wave of murmurs, a few nervous laughs, someone saying, "Did you see that?" to no one in particular. Ellie was standing 3 rows back, her hands over her mouth, her eyes glistening with something that was equal parts shock and fierce, aching pride. She'd known her grandfather was a veteran. She'd known he'd served in Desert Storm. She'd known about the shrapnel in his leg and the Purple Heart in a drawer he never opened. But she had never, not once in her 24 years, seen him do anything like what she'd just witnessed. She'd never even heard him raise his voice. The man she knew made birdhouses, read westerns on the porch, and put too much butter on his toast. The man she'd just watched dismantle a former college lineman with the casual precision of someone folding a napkin was a stranger to her. And the realization that her grandfather contained this entire hidden dimension of capability and controlled lethality, hit her with an emotional force that she wasn't prepared for. She wiped her eyes quickly and said nothing. Kyle walked forward. The room quieted again. Everyone was watching. "Harold," Kyle said. His voice had changed. It was still loud enough to carry, but the rehearsed smoothness was gone. In its place was something raw, something cautious, something that sounded a lot like a man trying to figure out how much of what he thought he knew had just been proven wrong. "Harold, where did you learn that?" Harold looked at Kyle. He didn't answer immediately. He flexed his right hand once, slowly, the way someone flexes a hand that has done the same thing too many times to count, and carries the ghost of every repetition in its joints. "Army combatives," Harold said. "Level 4, and some things before that had a different name." Kyle swallowed. "When you say Army combatives, you mean..." "I mean I was an instructor. Fort Bragg. 1986 to 1990. Before that, I studied judo in Okinawa during my second posting. After Bragg, I deployed to Southwest Asia with the 82nd Airborne." The words came out flat, factual, with no inflection designed to impress. Harold was reciting his history the way someone might recite a grocery list. Kyle's face had gone through several transformations in the last 90 seconds, from amusement to confusion to shock, and it now arrived at something that might have been the beginning of shame. "You were 82nd Airborne? That's correct. And you were a combatives instructor? For 4 years, taught close-quarters techniques to soldiers who were going to use them in places where their rifle wouldn't fit." The last sentence landed in the room like a stone dropped into still water. A man in the second row, one of the young ones who'd been grinning when Harold walked in, raised his hand tentatively, like a student in a classroom. "Sir, did you ever have to use it in actual combat?" Harold turned to look at him. The old man's expression was not cold, but it was not warm either. It was the expression of a man standing at the edge of a door he keeps closed, looking through the crack, deciding how much to let out. "Son," Harold said quietly, "there are things that happen in rooms with no windows and hallways with no lights that don't belong in a gym class on a Tuesday night. I'll say this much. The lock I just showed you works. It works on mats, and it works on concrete. It works when the other person is trying to grab you, and it works when the other person is trying to kill you. The only difference is how far you turn the wrist." Nobody in the room moved. Nobody breathed. The fluorescent lights hummed. The heavy bags hung motionless. Harold's words didn't echo because the rubber mats absorbed everything, but they lingered in the silence the way the sound of a bell lingers after the bell has stopped moving. Kyle stood very still. He was looking at Harold, but he wasn't seeing the limping old man who'd walked through his door with a cane and a field jacket anymore. He was seeing a ghost, the outline of someone who had lived in a world that Kyle's textbooks and seminars and YouTube tutorials had only ever described from the outside, like a travel guide written by someone who'd never left their hometown. "Harold," Kyle said. His voice was different now, quieter. "I owe you an apology." The room held its breath. Kyle Brandt was not, by nature or habit, a man who apologized. He was a man who corrected, who instructed, who maintained authority through certainty. But certainty had just been taken apart in 3 seconds by a pair of scarred hands that had been doing this since before he was born, and what was left in its place was something Kyle hadn't felt in a very long time. Humility. "I looked at you when you walked in, and I made a judgment. I saw the cane. I saw the limp. I saw your age, and I decided I knew what you were capable of based on what I could see." He paused. The room was utterly silent. "That's exactly the kind of thinking I'm supposed to be teaching people to overcome. Assessing a threat based on appearances, underestimating someone because they don't look like a threat. And I did it. I did it in front of this whole class, and I did it to a man who has more experience in his left hand than I have in my entire career." Kyle turned to face the class. "Let that be the first real lesson tonight. Not the wrist lock, although that was something. But this. Do not look at a person and decide what they are based on what you see. Do not look at age and see weakness. Do not look at a limp and see limitation. Because the man standing behind me walked through a war, taught soldiers how to survive with their bare hands, took shrapnel that's still in his leg, and just put our biggest guy on his back faster than I could explain the drill he was supposed to be doing. If that doesn't teach you something about assumptions, nothing will." Harold stood quietly through Kyle's speech. He didn't nod, he didn't smile, he didn't acknowledge the apology with any visible emotion. But Ellie, watching from 3 rows back, saw something that no one else in the room would have noticed. A very slight shift in her grandfather's posture. His shoulders dropped a fraction of an inch, his jaw unclenched by a degree. The tension that he carried, always, every day, a tension so permanent that it had become invisible to everyone who knew him, released just barely, the way a wire that's been wound too tight for 30 years might ease by a single turn when someone finally acknowledges the weight it's been holding. It was the closest thing to visible relief that Harold Eugene Maddox had allowed himself to show in public since 1991, and it happened because a 28-year-old man had done something that Harold had stopped expecting from people a very long time ago. He had looked at Harold, seen his mistake, and admitted it out loud. Kyle turned back to Harold. "I'd be honoured if you'd help me teach this class tonight, not as a student, as a guest instructor." Harold looked at Kyle, then he looked at the class. 18 faces looked back at him, and there was not a trace of pity, mockery, or dismissal on any of them. There was respect. Clean, unambiguous, hard-earned respect. The only kind Harold had ever valued. "I'm not here to take over your class, son," Harold said, "but I'll show you a few things if you want to learn." Kyle nodded. "I want to learn." For the next hour, Harold Maddox taught a self-defense class in Cedar Falls, Iowa. He didn't raise his voice, he didn't perform, he didn't tell war stories or name-drop his unit or explain the context of where he'd learned what he knew. He simply moved through the room, pair by pair, adjusting a grip here, correcting a stance there, demonstrating each technique slowly, precisely, and with an economy of motion that made every movement look simple and inevitable. He showed them the wrist lock, the real one, not the textbook version Kyle had been planning to teach, but the one Harold had learned at Bragg and refined in places he would never describe. He showed them how to redirect force instead of resisting it. He showed them how to use angles, how to control distance, how to remain calm when every instinct in their body was screaming at them to panic. He couldn't demonstrate the throws or the takedowns, his leg wouldn't allow it, but he talked Marcus through them, positioning his hands, adjusting his hips, and then watching as Marcus executed techniques he'd never seen before with an expression of intense concentration and growing respect. At one point, Marcus looked at Harold and said, "Sir, how many times have you done this?" Harold gave the smallest hint of a smile. "Enough." Ellie partnered with the dark-haired woman, whose name it turned out was Diana, and for the first time all evening, Ellie wasn't watching her grandfather with worry. She was watching him with wonder. This was a man she'd known her entire life, and she was only now seeing him in full. Every Sunday dinner, every birdhouse, every quiet evening on the porch had been the surface of a man whose depth she had never been invited to explore. And now here he was, moving through a room full of people half his age and less than half his experience, teaching them how to protect themselves with the patience and precision of someone who understood, in a way that no textbook could teach, exactly what violence was and exactly why you needed to know how to stop it. She thought about the Purple Heart in the drawer. She thought about the limp he never explained beyond an old injury. She thought about the nights she'd called and he hadn't answered, and the mornings when his voice sounded like he'd been awake for a very long time. She thought about all the things he'd never told her, and for the first time she didn't feel hurt by his silence. She felt grateful for it, because she understood, standing on that mat with tears she didn't bother to hide, that Harold's silence wasn't about keeping her out. It was about keeping the darkness in, keeping it contained, carrying it alone so that she, and everyone else he loved, would never have to feel its weight. When the class ended, something happened that Kyle had not planned and did not expect. The class applauded. It started with Marcus, who began clapping his massive hands together with a slow, deliberate rhythm, looking directly at Harold. Then Diana joined in, then Ellie, then the two young men in the second row who'd been grinning an hour ago and who now stood with straight backs and clapped with a kind of earnest, slightly embarrassed intensity of people who realise they've been educated in something far more important than a wrist lock. Then the whole room was clapping, and Harold stood in the middle of it with his hands at his sides and his face showing nothing except a very faint tightness around his eyes that Ellie recognised, because she'd seen it at her grandmother Ruth's funeral, and she'd seen it on the porch late at night when Harold thought no one was watching. It was the face of a man trying very hard not to feel something he'd kept locked away for a very long time. The applause lasted maybe 15 seconds. Then Harold nodded once, a small contained nod that acknowledged everything and revealed nothing, and walked to the wall to pick up his cane. Kyle caught up with him at the door. "Harold," the old man turned. Kyle extended his hand. "Thank you, for tonight, for not walking out when I gave you every reason to." Harold looked at Kyle's hand, then shook it, His grip was firm but measured. The handshake of a man who knew exactly how much force his hands could generate and chose to use exactly as much as was appropriate for the moment. "You've got good students," Harold said, "and you know more than you think you do. You just need to learn the difference between what you've been taught and what you know." Kyle let that settle. He nodded slowly. "Would you come back next week?" Harold looked at him. Then he looked at Ellie, who was standing by the front door with her gym bag over her shoulder and an expression that said, very clearly, "Please say yes." "I'll think about it," Harold said. But Ellie saw the corner of his mouth shift. Not a smile exactly, but the tectonic precursor of one. And she knew the answer was yes. They walked to the truck together in the parking lot. The night air was cold and sharp, the sky above Cedar Falls clear and littered with stars that you could actually see, because the town was small enough and quiet enough to let the sky be dark. Harold's limp was a little more pronounced than it had been going in. The cold and the movement had stiffened the leg, and Ellie walked slowly beside him without offering her arm, because she knew he wouldn't take it, and she knew he didn't need it. They reached the truck, a 2011 Chevy Silverado with rust around the wheel wells and a bench seat with a blanket folded over the passenger side. Ellie opened the driver's door for him. She always drove when they went out together at night, because Harold's night vision wasn't what it used to be, though he would never admit it. He climbed in, set his cane between his legs and sat for a moment with his hands on his knees, looking through the windshield at the gym's painted window, the fist inside the shield, the light still on inside. "Grandpa," Ellie said, getting into the passenger side. "Yeah." "Why didn't you ever tell me?" Harold didn't answer immediately. He watched a couple walk out of the gym, laughing, the young man shadowboxing the air as the young woman rolled her eyes and smiled. "There's things from over there that I don't talk about," Harold said. His voice was quiet, and for the first time all evening there was a weight in it that hadn't been there before. "Not because I'm ashamed, because they don't belong here. They belong in the sand, in the dark, in the rooms I went into and came out of. This." He gestured vaguely at the town around them, the parking lot, the stars, the cold Iowa air. "This is where I live now, and I want it to stay clean." Ellie reached across the bench seat and took his hand. His scarred, thick, steady hand. She held it and didn't say anything because there was nothing to say that wouldn't be smaller than the moment. Harold looked down at her hand in his. Then he looked at her, and for one brief second, a second so fleeting that if she'd blinked she would have missed it, Harold Eugene Maddox, 77 years old, retired Master Sergeant, United States Army, 82nd Airborne Division, veteran of Operation Desert Storm, holder of a Purple Heart and a Bronze Star that he kept in the same drawer and never looked at, survivor of things that had no names and left no scars you could see, allowed his eyes to fill. Not overflow, just fill. And then, with the discipline that had defined every single day of his life since he came home, he blinked, squeezed her hand and said, "Let's go home, sweetheart." Harold went back the next Tuesday, and the Tuesday after that, and every Tuesday for the rest of that session. Kyle never again told him to sit out. In fact, Kyle didn't tell anyone to sit out for the rest of his career, because the lesson Harold taught him on that first night wasn't just about wrist locks or combatives or the difference between what you learn from a book and what you learn from a war. It was about the danger of making someone invisible because they don't match the picture in your head. It was about the arrogance of youth, the silence of experience, and the lethal error of confusing frailty with inability. Kyle put a small sign on the wall of Iron Path Training Center next to the mirror where every student could see it before they stepped on the mat. The sign read, "Respect what you cannot see." He never told anyone where the phrase came from. He didn't need to, because every Tuesday evening, when a 77-year-old man with a limp and a wooden cane walked through the door and stepped onto the mat, every single person in that room already understood. Some people wear their strength on the outside. They build it in gyms, display it in fitted shirts, demonstrate it in front of mirrors and cameras and audiences who have never tested anything against anything real. And some people carry their strength so deep inside that you could sit across from them at a Sunday dinner table for 24 years and never once suspect what their hands were capable of. Harold Maddox was the second kind. The world has more of them than you think. They're in hardware stores and diners and church pews and rocking chairs and VA hospitals, and they will never tell you what they've done unless you earn the right to ask, and they decide the answer won't break something that can't be repaired. They carried the weight so we wouldn't have to. The least we can do, the very least, is never assume we know what someone is by looking at them. If this story reminded you to respect the people who don't ask for it, subscribe to the channel. Share this with someone who needs to hear it. And the next time you see an old man with a cane and a limp walking into a room where nobody thinks he belongs, pay attention. You might be looking at the most dangerous person in the building, and you'd never know it. Not unless he wanted you to.